Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to our third and final evening of this particular series of talks. Lovely to see you here, even though England is playing football, and this will be more interesting. Special pleasure to welcome you all, and even more pleasure to welcome a lady from the US of A, Marge Pierce, who would be related to McSparns of Lissanore and some other places. And I hope you just didn't come one ends earned for this particular meeting from America. But you're very welcome and lovely to have you. And we trust that you'll enjoy this evening's talk and a cup of tea afterwards in the hall when you get opportunity to have a chat with various folks. You're all invited for tea afterwards. I might say that the lectures this week have all been recorded, plus Sunday's service, and anybody that would like a recording, if you would speak to Stanley and give him your email address or your house address, Stanley will see to it that you will have a copy of whatever meeting you want, and he'll attend to that. You're all very welcome, and a special pleasure to welcome Mrs. Alison McCaughan, not really a stranger to Aghodewey. Her and her husband, the Reverend Jim, have been about Aghodewey for different occasions, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back again. And we look forward to listening to your talk, and I'll just hand over to you now.
Well, first of all, I better turn myself on. Stanley told me to. Technology. Is that better? Well, first of all, can I thank William for his very kind words of welcome, and indeed the opportunity to be here this evening. I know I've got competition, as William suggested, because England are playing. I don't know what the score is. Maybe somebody can have a sneak at their mobile phone, but it's good to be here, and thank you all for coming on such a lovely spell of weather. A couple of things I'd just like to say. I would like to thank Jennifer Cunningham as well for all her work to do with the exhibition. I've just had a brief preview of it, and I know Jennifer always gives of her best and always puts a lot of work into anything that she does, and she's kept local history alive, not just here but also in the whole area for so many years. So thank you, Jennifer, for that. And I'd also like to thank George Dallas. George was a tremendous help to us in Dumbo with our exhibition. I seemed to take about 2 trailer loads of things out of his house, but it didn't seem to make any difference. The house just looked the same, and he was extremely generous. I don't know if George is here this evening. Is he? He will be at some stage. So great character, and as I say, very, very generous with his help and his time with us. So we're very grateful to him. So I understand that in the first lecture, George, I think, did it about the reasons for going, and then Lindy took over last night and I think filled out some of the characters around this whole 1718 emigration. And what you've left me to do is to really finish the story about how they got to New England and what happened when they got there. I think that's the remit that you've given me. But as time has gone on, and I suppose as I have tried to find out a bit more about 1718, I've decided that it's a bit like researching your family tree. It never really comes to an end. And you're always learning something new about it. So what George asked me to do was maybe to recap just a little bit, maybe for people maybe who weren't here over the past couple of evenings. So I'm not going to recap everything, but just some things maybe that have struck me as I've tried to learn a bit more about 1718. And I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert or a professional historian, but it's something that has been very interesting to look at. And the first thing I would say is the Donegal influence, I think, is very important as to why people actually left. You see, there was a sense in which Irish Presbyterians thought of themselves not as some kind of dissenting sect, but actually as the Church of Ireland, as contemporary documents of the Presbytery of Antrim actually describe them. Now, of course, bishops of the established church, the Church of Ireland, found these Presbyterian pretensions intolerable. And certainly at the end of the 17th century in Donegal, they did all they could to destroy this rival church system. And they were particularly vigilant to prevent the advance of Presbyterianism in the south and west of Ireland. And when in 1676, the Lagan Presbytery, in response to requests from some Presbyterians in Sligo and Roscommon, sent two of their ministers to provide them with preaching of a pure gospel, the Bishop of Killala had them arrested and appealed to the Lord Lieutenant for protection from Scotch presbyteries who ramble up and down to debauch the people in their religion and loyalty. And 5 years later, in 1681, the Lagan Presbytery proclaimed a fast, calling their people to a day of prayer and fasting for the church in Britain and Ireland. Now, you'd think there wasn't much wrong with that, but they did it without any authority from the Crown, which regarded that as its sole prerogative. And as a result, 4 ministers of the Presbytery were brought before the Privy Council in Dublin. And during cross-examination, William Trail, the young clerk of the Lagan Presbytery, expounded the classic Presbyterian understanding of church-state relations. And he acknowledged that the state or the king had authority in matters ecclesiastical, but he had no authority to set up what government he pleases in the church. He had only power to set up true government of the church, and for Trail, it was self-evident that that was Presbyterianism. So for such outrageous comments, the 4 ministers were kept under house arrest for almost a year because they refused to pay a fine of £20 each. And it's hardly surprising that men like William Trail should have decided that if they were to have liberty of conscience and escape the misery which they considered was their lot in Ireland, they should venture into a new world of promise, which was opening up in colonial America. So in 1684, 5 ministers of the Lagan Presbytery in Donegal intimated to their brethren in the other presbyteries that they intended to emigrate. And that represented 30% of all the ministers in the Lagan Presbytery. Now, if you stand in Dumbo and look across, you will see Inishowen. In other words, it's just across there. And I'm quite sure that news of what happened in that presbytery 20, 30 years previously actually had reverberations over in the Lower Bann area. And interestingly, those 5 ministers, when they emigrated, became quite wealthy. The young William Trail acquired 133 acres in Maryland. Thomas Wilson acquired 350 acres in Maryland. Samuel Davis acquired 500 acres in Maryland. Josias Mackay, 150 acres and an owner of horses, and became a merchant as well as a minister. And of course, Francis McCaughan, who was the founder of the first American presbytery, married into wealth. He married the daughter of William Anderson. He became very rich. He had 2 homes in Virginia, and he became the second largest landowner in Accomack County in Virginia with 5,000 acres. So these men who emigrated, these ministers who emigrated, did very well. And I think that probably was another pull factor. We talk about push and pull factors, and I think the Donegal influence is part of this whole story. Secondly, the role of religious issues. And I'm sure George mentioned how economic concerns were crucial in stimulating the first wave of emigration in 1718. But even R.J. Dixon, who really is the historian of Ulster emigration, stressed that it would be unwise to dismiss lightly the religious aspects of the movement. And that's also stressed by Patrick Fitzgerald in his introduction to Dixon's republished book in 2016. So when he preached his final sermon, James McGregor, your minister here in Aghodewey, stressed the religious reasons for leaving. Now, some have argued that this was McGregor's final riposte or dig to the Church of Ireland establishment before he sailed across the Atlantic. But in 1718, Presbyterian grievances were very deeply felt. I mean, when you think about it, their ministers were denied entrance to Trinity College Dublin. They felt that they didn't get their just reward for all their sacrifice that was made at the Siege of Derry. They were criticised for behaving like a state within a state. The Hate at Test Act of 1704 meant that they were regarded as social outcasts. There was a glass ceiling beyond which they couldn't progress. The refusal of Church of Ireland ministers to license Presbyterian school teachers or recognise the validity of Presbyterian marriages, thus putting in jeopardy children's inheritance rights, caused deep resentment. They had to pay tithes to a church they didn't attend. The Regium Donum was suspended, although later it was reinstated. And the whole perception was by Presbyterians that they were treated very shabbily indeed. And on the other hand, the Church of Ireland regarded them really with deep resentment. They resented the refusal of the Presbyterians to worship in an Anglican manner. From their point of view, as a minority of the Irish population, Presbyterian numbers, which were growing all the time, weakened Protestantism. Presbyterian ministers were regarded as fanatics in Anglican propaganda. By their preaching, Presbyterian ministers could force their faith on others. They challenged Anglican creeds and worship. For example, Dean Jonathan Swift of Dublin compared Irish Presbyterians to a dangerous viper that would be the death of anyone foolish enough to live alongside it. For he that hath so little wit, wrote Swift, to nourish venom may be bit. Kirk sessions were seen as a challenge to the Church of Ireland establishment as they policed almost every aspect of life within a Presbyterian community, from Sabbath breaking to adultery to stealing or robbing a neighbour's potato patch. Presbyterians represented a strong, cohesive society, and their lives centred around their church, and that was a threat to the establishment. And then to go further, The Archdeacon of Ossory, Edward Walkington, stated in a sermon in 1693, referring to Presbyterian dissenters and their dislike of the Church of Ireland's use of vestments and robes. And he said, "I'm tempted to believe that there's something more than religion and conscience at the bottom of these matters, that lawn sleeves and caps and surplices are too mean a quarry for these men to fly at, and that crowns and sceptres, I mean the monarchy in general, is the true and real grievance." The establishment was aware of the strong connections that Presbyterian ministers had with Scotland, and by the end of the 17th century, Presbyterianism was the established religion in Scotland, and of course there, bishops had finally been disposed of. So Walkington was hinting that Presbyterianism was actually a threat to the state itself. After all, hadn't the slogan much earlier in the 17th century been, "No bishop, no king"? So, in summary, the Church of Ireland establishment felt that Presbyterians just could not be trusted. They were a threat, not just to the Anglican Church, but implicitly to the very social order of Ireland. So the harassment of Presbyterians, it certainly wasn't constant, but it could be turned on and off. And that uncertainty was very wearing. And it's worth noting that the Test Act was not repealed until 1780. And it wasn't until 1857, that a Presbyterian was first elected to an Irish county seat in Parliament. And interestingly, the MP was Samuel McCurdy Greer, son of the Reverend Thomas Greer, minister of Dumbo from 1802 to 1812, when he stood against Harvey Bruce of Downhill Castle. So in 1718, many Presbyterians really did view their world through the prism of their faith. They regarded themselves as a covenant and chosen people. They were pastored by their ministers, who had a special standing within a Presbyterian community. So when James MacGregor of Aghodewey and James Woodside of Dumbo were determined to leave and go to the New World, families in their congregations responded and were prepared to follow. There was a popular demand to leave as families and to establish, hopefully, their own Presbyterian worshipping communities and to build a new Ulster in the New World. So events moved quickly. And in March 1718, a petition, and you've got the names over in the hall, addressed to Governor Shute of Massachusetts and signed by 319 individuals, including 9 Presbyterian ministers, stated their inclination to transport themselves to that very excellent plantation. And the man delegated to carry the petition to New England and really to scout out the possibility of a large migration of Irish Presbyterians was the Reverend William Boyd of McCauscowen. And he was in the first ship which arrived in Boston in July 1718. And he seems to have made a favourable impression with the Reverend Cotton Mather, a leading Puritan, who wrote that he hoped that much may be done for the kingdom of God in these parts by their, that's the Ulster immigrants, transportation. And I think Mather becomes a key figure in the 1718 story. He was a son of Increase Mather. He had family links in Ireland, with 2 of his uncles being Anglican ministers in Dublin, and he had positive contacts with Irish Presbyterian ministers in the Dublin area. With the flow of emigration largely stopped from England, his initial hope must have been that any Presbyterian immigrants from Ireland would blend in easily with the theologically similar Congregationalist New Englanders into what one historian has described as one larger Calvinist community. And in November 1717, Mather, the Reverend William Holmes, also from Ireland, his son Robert, who was a sea captain, and crucially, some land speculators who were hoping to plant settlements in particularly Maine, they met together and agreed to transport people from Ulster to New England. And in the meantime, Governor Shute gave assurances, quotes, to Boyd of McCausquin, but no specific guarantees of actual lands for prospective immigrants. And not waiting to hear if any lands had actually been set aside, James MacGregor delivered his final sermon, taking his text from Exodus chapter 33, stating that he and his people were leaving to avoid oppression and cruel bondage, to shun persecution and designed ruin, to withdraw from the communion of idolaters, and to have an opportunity of worshipping God according to the dictates of conscience and the rule of his inspired word. To the Presbyterians, a covenant people, MacGregor must have seemed like Moses, and the Atlantic, the Red Sea. And at the quaysides in Derry and Coleraine, expectations would have been riding high. So the ships started to sail almost exactly 300 years ago. And on board there were families from here in Aghodewey, from McCausquin, Coleraine, Kilray, Bavidi, Dumbo, Ballymoney, Garva and Ballywillan. And as part of the migration, there were also families from the Foyle Valley, from Limavady, and from the Donegal and Tyrone sides, and a number of families who came from Ardstraw. Now, interestingly, Boyd from McCausquin, who presented the petition to Governor Shute, never emigrated. On reflection, he must have considered Ireland to be the better option, because he returned in 1719 and stayed in McCausquin until 1725, when he became Minister of Monrea in County Donegal. Now, we don't know what the journey across the Atlantic was like. R.J. Dixon, historian of the 18th century Ulster immigration, states that approximately 1,000 North Irish people disembarked from 10 vessels in Boston in 1718. Traditionally, there were 5 ships, although according to Boston newspapers, 15 ships sailed into Boston Harbour from Ireland in 1718. We don't know the number of immigrants because there are no passenger lists at that time, but there were probably between 500 and 1,000 who arrived midsummer, early autumn of that year. We can be sure of one thing: it was no Atlantic cruise. The ships were small. The McCallum or the McCollum, which carried Woodside and the Dunbow contingent, was just 70 tons. And some of the other ships were considerably less. The one that carried the Aghodewey folk was just 30 tons. The journey lasted some 8 weeks, with MacGregor's boat arriving on the 29th of July, 1718, and Woodside's in early September. Families would have been allocated water, meat and oatmeal, and their living space for the journey would have been no bigger than 2,000 square feet. No privacy, and buckets would have been used for toilets. In bad weather, the passengers would have been locked down perhaps for a number of days, which must have been oppressive and dark and claustrophobic. If anyone fell ill, well, there was no one to help them, just the people on board. And what kept them going was the hope of something better than what they left behind. So, what happened when this human tide of Ulster immigrants washed up in the New World? It could be summarised in 2 words: expectations shattered. Because another establishment, this time a New England one, which held sway in Boston, feared that the ships from Ireland brought only famine, disease, paupers, and papists. I tried to explain to the children at our own exhibition, what do you look like if you step off a plane after 8 hours? Now, these people had been in a boat for 8 weeks. What do you think they looked like? They looked poor and dishevelled, and the Boston people who had been in that area for 100 years thought, no. After enduring a long and difficult voyage, we can only imagine that these folk from Ulster would have felt a sense of deep despair when it became clear that they were not welcome. Indeed, one observer noted that the Scots-Irish were met with a volley of sticks, stones, and other offensive weapons. Coming after the worst winter ever in New England in 1717, the people of Boston were alarmed at the manners, the lifestyle, the language. They spoke English, but they didn't speak it the way the folk in New England spoke it, and the poverty of the immigrants coming from Ulster, despite the fact that many of them had actually paid their passage. Those who held political power in Boston now implemented their strategy, which they had a number of months earlier discussed. While some of the immigrants were allowed to stay in the city, where they were subsequently informed that they would be placed on the tax roll with non-payment not an option, the overall plan for the Ulster immigrants was threefold. Firstly, position the immigrants on the frontier from Maine to Massachusetts as a human barrier to protect themselves and to repopulate settlements which had been abandoned during the Indian Wars of the late 17th century. Those wars had been devastating, and by 1713 there was not a single English house which stood north of Wells in South Maine. Secondly, create a barrier against the French in Canada, which was just north of Maine. Thirdly, the boundaries between the provinces in New England were at this stage fluid, and it was considered advantageous for each province to take as much land as possible for itself, on the understanding that occupation was 9/10 of the law. And into this mix, there were also property speculators who were determined to make as much money as possible by settling the immigrants from Ulster on the frontiers. So those warm words of encouragement to come on over must now have seemed somewhat hollow. And as a result, there evolved two main areas of settlement for the 1718 Lower Bann Valley immigrants. But first of all, a word about the Foyle Valley immigrants, who largely settled in Worcester in Massachusetts. And I think William has given you a copy of the 1718 booklet. So if you turn to the map is on page 14. I'll just refer to that, page 14. Away down there in the south, do you see Massachusetts? You've got Massachusetts and then Connecticut. And you see the town of Worcester. The Foyle Valley immigrants were led by the Reverend Edward Fitzgerald. I don't know if Lindy talked about him last night. She suggested at the conference in Garva that he was actually a converted Roman Catholic priest. He appears here for a little while and then he disappears altogether. But he's a very interesting person, and it would be, I think she was trying to find out more about him. Anyway, they were led by Fitzgerald, and although they were only 40 miles from the coast, Worcester was considered a key position for the defence of Massachusetts and an opening to the frontier country to the west. Now, for the 1718 folk from Ulster, it didn't go well. They were welcomed initially, but there were constant disputes with the English Puritans. And when they finally decided to build their meeting house, it was burnt down by a mob led by some of the town's most eminent citizens. And many families in Worcester left and moved on to towns like Pelham, Sutton, and to Voluntown in present-day Connecticut, where the Reverend Samuel Dorrans from the Coleraine Presbytery became their minister. And they also founded new towns like Coleraine, and in later years made their way as far as New York State. You see, if land was cheap, the Scots-Irish, as they eventually became known in America, were invariably quick to take advantage, sometimes as squatters. So having moved from Scotland to Ulster, to Boston, to Worcester, another move, no great hardship. And some of the names associated with that Worcester group that would be around today would be McClellans, Caldwells, Blairs, McFarlands, Rankins, Duncans, Grahams, Kelsos, Clarks, Fergusons, McClintocks, and McConkeys, all Ulster names. And secondly then, the Bann Valley immigrants, because the folk from Aghodewey are undoubtedly the best known part of this whole saga. MacGregor, I'm sure Lindy talked about MacGregor last night. He was the son of Captain MacGregor of McGilligan, educated at Glasgow, ordained here in Aghodewey in 1701, the third minister of your congregation. He was married to Marion Cargill. They had 10 children, and you know the famous incident when he was admonished by the synod for being drunk, and he said that he'd taken some cans of ale, but he was not drunk. Did she tell you about that? Oh, right. He was often called to preach in Irish to the Irish people. He was a fluent Irish speaker, as were a number of the ministers at that time. MacGregor had cordial relations with Cotton Mather, and Cotton Mather was a powerful political cleric in Boston. And interestingly, he settled that first winter not far from Boston at a place called Draycote. Do you see that? Just south of, North Massachusetts, Draycote. And he preached there during the winter. In the meantime, MacGregor petitioned Governor Shute for land. His brother-in-law, James McKean, and some 300 immigrants went to Maine and spent the winter starving and freezing at Casco Bay, which you can see further up north there. And the ship was frozen in for that whole winter. It must have been just miserable. Leaving some of the party in Portland in the spring of 1719, McKean's family with 16 to 19 other families set sail and headed south to the Merrimack River, and then up the river to a place called Haverhill, where they found an unsettled tract of land called Nutfield. And on the 12th of April 1719, MacGregor left Draycote and joined them and preached his first sermon to his own people from Isaiah 32, verse 2. And of course, Haverhill and Nutfield is what they eventually renamed Londonderry. And you can see it there just in South New Hampshire. And it was a wilderness, a complete wilderness. And when they looked out at it with ferocious wild animals, where survival depended on clearing huge first growth trees, and women faced childbirth with next to no help, their overwhelming feeling must surely have been one of utter loneliness. And in fact, when they considered what they had in Ulster, it must have seemed like stepping back 100 years. And many disputes over land rights followed. But by 1720, the New Hampshire government finally gave the settlers a grant of land, 10 miles square, for a town whose inhabitants renamed it Londonderry in 1721. And MacGregor became their first minister, and it is said that he climbed into the pulpit each Sunday with his gun well loaded and primed in case of Indian attacks. He died in 1729, no longer a poor man, with a substantial house and a considerable number of acres. And with the freedom to organise their own affairs, their own church worship and church government in a Presbyterian form, in 6 years they had 4 schools, and within 9 years of its first settlement, Londonderry paid 1/15 of the state tax in New Hampshire. Within a generation, Londonderry had almost 2,500 inhabitants and a thriving industry in the manufacture of linen cloth and yarn. MacGregor's widow, Marion, married the Reverend Matthew Clark, minister of Kilrea, who at the age of 70 emigrated to America. And in addition to being married for the 3rd time, he became the next minister of the Presbyterian Church in Londonderry. And Clark died in 1735, and his mortal remains were carried to the grave by those who had stood with him at the siege of Derry. And again, some of the descendants of the 1718 settlers moved on, and by mid-century they were crossing the Connecticut River to resettle in Vermont, while others moved as far as Nova Scotia in Canada. And I'll just read you some of the petitions which the Aghodewey folk, in the spring of 1719, when they were trying to get the lands and get their lands established, they wrote this petition to Governor Samuel Shute, and they said in this, and this gives you something of the mindset. They talk about arriving and saying, "We were surprised to hear ourselves when we arrived termed Irish people, when we so frequently ventured our all for the British crown and liberties against the Irish papists, and gave all tests of our loyalty which the government of Ireland required, and are always ready to do the same here when demanded." So that was a very strong feeling that they had. And whilst now in America it's cool to be Irish, in those days they didn't want to be considered Irish. And in another petition, they talk about, this was in, what date was this? Actually in 1730, when there's a lot of disputes between New Hampshire and Massachusetts about the boundary. They say, "We could bear the many scandalous and unjust reflections which are cast upon us by saying we are Romans and not good subjects to his present majesty, being well assured your honour well knows to the contrary, having many of us resolutely opposed both, while in our own country witness the troubles in Ireland at the coming in of King William of blessed memory, our present minister, and several of our people being at the siege of Derry, and had no small share in the glorious defence of our religion and country." So they're very strong on that they did their bit at the siege of Derry. And when George lent me a picture of the siege of Derry, I wondered where to put it. Would I put it in the Siege of Derry exhibition, and eventually put it over in the Aghodewey side, the Aghodewey exhibition, or the bit that we did about Aghodewey, because so often they talked about being at the siege of Derry and what they had done there. So secondly then, the Dunbow contingent, who with others settled in Maine, and I suppose was the least well known of the 1718 story. The Reverend James Woodside of Dunbow didn't have MacGregor's backstory. We know that he was from Scotland. He was ordained in Dunbow in 1698, after a period of 7 years when Dunbow didn't have a minister. And early on in his ministry, he was owed money. And the Root Presbytery expressed concern about their brother minister in Dumbo. Now, whether his situation improved or not, we don't know. But one writer states that Woodside wrote to Cotton Mather regarding emigration around 1717. And Mather replied in the warmest of terms, saying, "'Tis more than time that your brethren here should bid you welcome to the western side of the Atlantic, and make you a tender of all the brotherly assistance that we are capable of giving you." Although Cotton Mather wrote on September the 13th, shortly after the McCallum arrived, among the families arrived from Ireland, I find many wondrous objects for my compassions. Woodside's Dumbo party were made as unwelcome in Boston as all the other immigrants. But in addition, they soon found themselves the object of some keen bargaining as land speculators tried to woo them as settlers. And some people think that they weren't even allowed to get off the ship. Captain Robert Temple, originally from Cork in the south of Ireland, had ambitions to be a landed proprietor in America. And Temple met up with a number of others known as the Pejebscot Company, and he agreed to become the company's agent to arrange for immigrants to settle along the Kennebec River. And you'll see that away up north. You're going really up north now, up north of Casco Bay. And although originally Temple tried to persuade Captain Law of the McCallum and his party to go to Connecticut, the ship soon set sail for lands on offer at 12 pence an acre at the mouth of the Kennebec River. And they arrived there in late September, less than 4 weeks after reaching Boston. And they were simply pawns in a land grab. It all started well. They settled in fertile areas with fresh water and good grass for their cattle, but it didn't last. The indigenous people, the Abenaki Indians, were angry at the invasion of their territory and ordered them to leave. They protested that the newcomers' cattle trampled their native plantings and consumed the food needed for migratory birds. The Abenaki people asked the newcomers to fence in their cattle, but the settlers refused. Meanwhile, more settlers came in during the next 2 years. And the settlers asked Boston for help, but not forthcoming. The inevitable happened. And when it came in 1722, it came with a vengeance. The Indians swept in, killed some of the settlers, burnt houses, slaughtered livestock, carried off some of the men north to French-held Quebec. The women and children escaped, some going back to Boston, where Governor Shute called them traitors for leaving their homes. Some fled to more densely populated areas in Maine, like Brunswick and Topsham, while others moved to New Hampshire or went to Pennsylvania. And eventually that settlement was completely abandoned. As families dispersed and they reflected on the hard sea crossing, the cold welcome in Boston, the reluctance of anybody to help them, and the sheer fear of frontier living, they must have concluded that the so-called New World was no more than another part of the same old world with all its problems. What happened to the Reverend James Woodside? Well, it seems that he settled for a time at a place called Falmouth. As some of the Dumbo immigrants had moved to Brunswick and they didn't have a minister, it was decided to call him to Brunswick. They offered him £40 per annum, a habitable house, and removal expenses. He took up the charge, but he didn't stay long. In May 1719, the Brunswick folk voted to continue his services for 6 more months, only on condition that his character improve. It has been suggested that he was not puritanical enough for the Brunswick Congregationalists, and as it was reputed he had leanings toward the rituals of the Church of England, he wasn't acceptable to the Presbyterians either. So he didn't measure up, and he was sacked. He returned to Boston, and in June 1720 he sailed for London, England, a deeply disappointed man. Ironically, he carried in his pocket a warm note of recommendation from none other than that distinguished cleric, the Reverend Cotton Mather, who described him as poor Mr. Woodside. He never returned to Ireland. Other settlers were brought into Maine by land agents David Dunbar, whose objective was to provide white pine growing in Maine and New Hampshire for ships' masts for the British Navy, and later by Samuel Waldo. But for those who remained in small townships, particularly along the east side of the Kennebec River, frontier hardships would continue to plague them because the Indian Wars lasted right through to 1760, and there were constant disputes over land. John Mann of the Ulster Scots Project, the Maine Ulster Scots Project, has written, "Holding their foothold at the eastern frontier meant struggling against tremendous challenges, but they held fast and they spread, and dozens of small settlements followed. And there were at least 32 settlements of Scots and Scots-Irish prior to the American Revolution in Maine alone." However, New England was not fertile territory for Presbyterianism, and Cotton Mather placed the blame firmly on the incomers when he wrote that the migration of Ulster Presbyterians has been, quote, "a marvellous grief unto us. There have been some who have most indecently and ungratefully given much disturbance to the peace of our churches." The middle colonies of America would prove to be, later on, the main destination of Irish Presbyterians. Now, there are two interesting postscripts to this. Firstly, some of Woodside's family chose to remain in Brunswick, and they became quite prominent. And during the subsequent Indian attack there in 1722, the settlers retreated to Woodside's garrison house as a place of refuge. And as a result, Woodside's family lost all their cattle and possessions. And in 1723, Woodside petitioned the English king for compensation, in which he claimed that he had brought 160 people with him on the 1718 journey. And that's how we know how many were on the Dumbo ship. And that's why we put 160 cardboard cutouts in the pews. Secondly, the abandoned Cork settlement is now being investigated as part of an archaeological dig coordinated by the Maine Ulster Scots Project, established in 2005 by the St Andrew Society of Maine. And Brad and Cindy McFadden joined us last week as part of that exhibition that they had. And in fact, the dig is on Brad McFadden's land. So, as the 18th century progressed, emigration from Ulster continued apace. Fragile Ulster economy remained vulnerable to recurring economic crisis, and waves of emigration occurred at such times. In the early 1770s, for example, the resident landlord of the cloth workers, Richard Jackson, raised the rents of his tenants very considerably, and one historian has noted that there was an almost total emigration from the districts of Dumbo and McCosquin. Meanwhile, a myriad of commercial links developed between Belfast, Derry and American ports, particularly with the importing of flaxseed from the American colonies, which was used for the linen industry, particularly around here. And publications like the Belfast Newsletter kept Presbyterians informed as to what was happening to their kith and kin across the Atlantic. And as the Ulster economy strengthened in the 18th century, many still made a rational choice to emigrate, with the prospect of land, free from interfering landlords, continuing to be an almost irresistible draw. Clearing such virgin land was backbreaking. Most of the settlers lived far from markets and towns, and the threat of murder from native Indians who were continually pushed out of their territory was always close at hand. The settlers kept cattle, grew crops like wheat, rye, flax and potatoes. They introduced the Irish potato to the American colonies and tried to sell their woven linen. somehow a living was eked out. Some prospered, but not all. Succeeding waves of settlers largely bypassed New England and continued to emigrate as they had done from the end of the 17th century, further south along the American coast, through towns like Newcastle, Delaware, and Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. And by 1790, 1/4 of the white population of Pennsylvania was Irish-born or had Irish ancestry. And from there, the Ulster settlers eventually moved into western Pennsylvania and through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and the Cumberland Gap, where Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia meet. Always mobile, always land hungry, into the Carolinas and Georgia. As R.J. Dixon has written, the significance of 1718 is that the floodgates of emigration were opened for the first time as an outlet for the distressed and discontented, and it showed that for those left behind, life in America was a practical alternative to life in Ireland. In summary, leaving became a norm, and certainly that was true for our congregation. And we know from the Coleraine Presbytery minutes that in First Dumbo in 1846, Dumbo had 700 families. In 1856, 600 families. In 1867, 420 families. And in 1889, 240 families. Now, not all of those who emigrated went overseas. Some went to Derry, to Belfast, others to Scotland and England. Others went not just to America, but to Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. But the overall trend in the number of families in Dumbo was one way, and it was down, a decrease of 64% in 43 years. And finally, a short reflection about emigration and those left behind. There has been over the years an interest in the Scots-Irish in America, and it's been driven by books like W.F. Marshall's Ulster Sails West, Hard Crummie's Ulster Settlers in America, Rory Fitzpatrick's God's Frontiersmen, the Billy Kennedy books, and James Webb's Born Fighting of 2004. And in many of those books, the Scots-Irish are portrayed as individualists, doers, strong, stubborn fighters, anti-authoritarian, defenders of family, home, property, fundamentalists in religion, heroes. The truth's a bit more subtle. Patrick Griffin has written, amid periods of change, the Scots-Irish in America defined and redefined their understanding of themselves and the world around them. It was Eston Evans writing in an essay as early as 1969 who emphasised not so much the Scots-Irish in America's contribution to politics, religion, education and leadership, which was significant. For example, 17 presidents have Ulster ancestry, but rather how they so quickly adapted to their environment by taking elements of other cultures like the Swedish log cabin or Indian herbal medicine and making them their own. In addition, they often made strong social networks, and not a few of them created wealth because they were canny with their money. And like their neighbours from other countries in the New World, they melted into the melting pot and became within a generation or two Americans. But more relevant for us, what about those who didn't go, those left behind? And I've quoted this a number of times, Linda Lunny, but I'll quote it again. She said this at a family history conference in 2011. Starting from the time of the 1718 emigration, perhaps as much as a third of every generation in Ulster, up until my parents' generation left, taking some elements of their Ulsterness with them to go and live and die somewhere else. People who remained in Ulster lost sisters, brothers, cousins, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, neighbours, Sunday school classmates, people who sat beside them in church, folk they'd been accustomed to meeting at the marketplace, friends and relatives, were lost again and again and again, just not at one point in an individual's life or in one generation. For the first half dozen generations after 1718, it was the equivalent of dying. There was no news beyond the Atlantic, just the same as beyond the grave. And she's also gone to talk about how emigration seemed to be something that happened to the brightest and the best in any generation. Those with get up and go got up and went. They realised the capital, took it with them, shook the dust off their hobnail boots, and off they went. And of course, the understanding of that is that if the brightest and best leave, then it's the second rate and the third rate who are left behind. And she says it's not quite clear how the backward dolts of one generation manage to produce, educate and inspire the next generation of high achievers who in their turn head for the bright lights wherever. As we are now at this very significant 300th anniversary of the 1718 emigration, almost to the day, instead of focusing exclusively on those who left, we need to acknowledge the incalculable loss felt by those who were left behind. And that's why we made our final exhibit last week a reflective one of a person sitting in a garden. There's a chair, there's an open book, and there's little old-fashioned glasses. And the idea is that someone who has had people who left, sitting back here in the garden, just reflecting and thinking. And Linda Lundy suggested that it's not a celebration, it's a commemoration. And if we're doing anything, we should be trying to reconnect families and reflect on what emigration meant for people left behind in Ulster. And when you also consider the Roman Catholic emigration to America in the 19th century, emigration is something that has deeply marked every family in Ireland, north, south, east, west, and across all of our communities. In 1926, the Reverend James Mark raised $3,500 in America for the present Dumbo Church, and he managed to raise more money over the next 10 years. And the present church in Dumbo was opened at the end of July in 1936. And he called it an Irish-American church because so much money came from America. In 1927, at a congregational meeting after he came back from that American tour, Mr. and Mrs. Mark were presented with gifts in appreciation of all their work, and addresses were delivered by neighbouring clergy, including the Reverend William Farley of Castle Rock, who, speaking of his neighbouring colleagues' delight at returning home, stated that Mr. Mark has seen the Mississippi, the Hudson, he has seen the Niagara Falls, but he questioned if he'd ever seen anything finer or dearer to him than the Articliff River or the Pot o' Burn. And perhaps that is what the 1718 commemorations should seek to achieve, connecting with long-lost, forgotten friends in America, but paying tribute to those who stayed here, who stood firm, nurtured the next generation, faithfully continued to support and build up the church of their forefathers, and stayed at home. Thank you. William, will we go and get a cup of tea? Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, before we go for a cup of tea, I would just like, on your behalf, to say a very big thank you to Alison for a very interesting talk, and we appreciate all the hard work that she has taken to put that all together, and I think we should show our appreciation by a good round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tea served in the other hall. There's the exhibition. If you haven't seen it, take time before you go home, and we'll enjoy each other's company over there. And if you have any questions for Alison, she'll be more than happy to answer them when we get there. But as we're going for tea, we'll just say a word of grace and a word of thanks. Heavenly Father, as we come to the end of our series of talks, we thank you for the opportunity of being able to look back at our ancestors 300 years ago and their endeavours then. And as we thank you for the events of those years, we look forward in faith that you will continue to bless with this congregation and lead it, especially now in the time of vacancy. We will know your guiding hand upon us. Thank you for your leading in the past and for the generations that have passed the faith faithfully on to succeeding generations. Continue to be with us now this evening and bless our time together over tea and coffee. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much for your keen comments.
Not at all.